The doors of Ravenscroft House swung open at exactly 9 o'clock. Every candle in the great ballroom seemed to flicker at once. The music stumbled, and then the footman's voice rang out over 300 of the finest heads in London. Mrs. Rosalind Grantham, widow of the late Mr. Edward Grantham. The name fell on the crowd like a stone dropped into still water. Grantham, the asterisk Grantham, the merchant king, the man whose fortune, people whispered, could buy half of England and still have enough left over for the other half. And his widow, the woman who now owned every penny of it, was standing in the doorway of the Duke of Ravenscroft's ballroom, uninvited. She wore deep midnight blue silk. Diamonds rested at her throat like drops of frozen light. She did not hurry. She did not smile at the crowd. She simply walked, slow and certain, across a floor that had gone completely silent. At the far end of the room, Julian Ashworth, the Duke of Ravenscroft, stood frozen with a glass of champagne halfway to his lips. Because he knew that face. 3 years ago, that face had belonged to a girl in a patched gown, a girl he had laughed at in front of everyone in this very room, a girl who had walked out of these doors with her head down and disappeared. Now she stopped in front of him, close enough that only he could hear her. "Your Grace," her voice was soft, almost gentle, "I believe you once found my gown amusing." The Duke's glass trembled in his hand. But to understand that moment, to understand why the richest widow in England had come back to this house of all houses, we must go back 3 years. Back to the night of the laugh. 3 years earlier, Rosalind Fairchild owned exactly one ball gown. It had belonged to her mother. After her mother died, Rosalind had taken it apart and sewn it back together twice, patching the worn places at the hem with pieces cut from her mother's old wedding dress. If you looked closely, and she prayed no one would, you could see where the ivory patches met the faded rose silk, like scars. But it was clean, it was pressed, and it was all she had. "You don't have to do this," her father said that evening. He sat by the cold fireplace of their rented rooms, a blanket over his knees, looking 10 years older than he was. "There must be another way." "There is no other way, Papa." Rosalind knelt beside his chair and took his thin hands in hers. "The Duke of Ravenscroft holds your largest debts. One conversation, that's all I need. If I can just speak to him man to man, as you used to say, I can ask for time, 6 months. We only need 6 months." Her father's eyes filled. "Your mother wore that dress the night I met her." "Then it's lucky," Rosalind said and made herself smile. "And tonight we need all the luck in England." She had begged the invitation from an old school friend, Charlotte, whose husband was too unimportant to refuse and too kind to ask questions. Charlotte squeezed her arm as they climbed the marble steps of Ravenscroft House. "Whatever happens," Charlotte whispered, "keep your chin up. They can smell fear in there, Rosalind. I mean it, like hounds." The ballroom took her breath away. 1,000 candles, mirrors taller than doors, silk gowns in every color God ever made, and some he surely hadn't. Rosalind stood at the edge of it all in her patched dress and felt, for one dizzy moment, like a sparrow that had flown into a palace of peacocks. One conversation, she told herself, find the Duke, ask for 6 months, then leave. She spotted him near the great fireplace. Julian Ashworth, Duke of Ravenscroft, was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, dark-haired, with the kind of face that would have been handsome if it ever relaxed. It didn't. He stood stiff as a soldier while an older woman in purple velvet spoke into his ear, the Dowager Duchess, his mother. Rosalind took a breath, straightened her shoulders, and crossed the floor. She never got the chance to speak first. Good heavens! The Dowager Duchess's voice was not loud, but it was made to carry. It sliced through the music like a blade through ribbon. "Julian, look. I do believe someone's seamstress has wandered in through the wrong door." A few heads turned, then more. Rosalind stopped, her heart hammered. "Your Grace, forgive me. My name is Rosalind Fairchild. My father is Mr. Thomas Fairchild, and I hoped—" "Fairchild?" The dowager said the name the way one might say the word mud. "Ah, yes, the debtor." Her eyes traveled slowly, deliberately from Rosalind's face down to the hem of her gown and stopped at the ivory patches. "Tell me, child, did you sew those patches yourself, or could you not afford the seamstress either?" Someone tittered, then someone else. Rosalind's face burned, but she kept her chin up just as Charlotte had said. She looked past the dowager straight at the Duke, her last hope. "Your Grace, I ask only for a moment of your time. Please, my father." "Julian," the dowager's voice hardened. "The Halloway family arrives within the hour. Your future bride will walk into this room. And this," she gestured at Rosalind's gown as if it were something spilled on the carpet, "is what greets her. A patchwork beggar chasing you across your own ballroom. People are watching, Julian. Everyone is watching. Show them what you think of it." And everyone was watching. 300 faces turned toward the Duke like flowers toward the sun. Rosalind saw something flicker in his eyes she would spend 3 years trying to name it. Hesitation. Shame. For half a heartbeat, his mouth opened as if to say something else entirely. Then his mother's hand closed on his arm. And the Duke of Ravenscroft looked at Rosalind Fairchild, at her mother's dress, at the wedding gown patches, at the careful, hopeful stitching of a desperate girl. And he laughed. It was not even a cruel laugh. That was the worst of it. It was short and hollow, and it sounded almost like it hurt him. But it was a laugh, and it came from a duke, and that was all the permission 300 people needed. The ballroom exploded. Laughter rolled over her from every direction, from painted fans and champagne glasses, from men she'd never met and women who didn't know her name. Someone said the asterisk patches asterisk. And it started all over again. The music itself seemed to laugh. Rosalind stood perfectly still in the middle of it. She did not cry. She would not give them that. She looked at the Duke one last time. He had turned away, his jaw tight, his mother smiling beside him like a woman admiring her own needlework. And then Rosalind Fairchild curtsied. Slow, graceful, perfect. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said, and her voice did not shake. "You have taught me more tonight than 6 months ever could." Then she turned and walked the longest walk of her life, across that shining floor, through that wall of laughter, past Charlotte's horrified face, and out into the cold October night. On the marble steps her heel caught the worn hem of her mother's gown. The fabric tore. A piece of it, one small ivory patch, cut from a wedding dress, came loose and fluttered down onto the stone. Rosalind didn't stop to pick it up. But someone else did. Inside the ballroom, the Duke of Ravenscroft stood at the tall window, unseen by the laughing crowd, and watched the girl in the torn gown disappear into the dark. His champagne sat untouched. His hands, behind his back, were clenched so hard his knuckles had gone white. He did not know her yet. He did not know what that laugh had just cost her, or what it would cost him. He only knew one thing, with a certainty that frightened him. He would hear that laugh, his own laugh, every night for the rest of his life. And 3 years later, when the footman called out the name * Grantham and the doors swung open, he did. In London, a duke's laugh is not just a laugh. It is a verdict. By morning, the story had traveled through every drawing room in Mayfair, growing with each telling. By noon, Rosalind Fairchild was no longer Thomas Fairchild's unfortunate daughter. She was the patchwork beggar, the girl so desperate she had chased the Duke of Ravenscroft across his own ballroom in a dress made of rags. By the end of the week, the letters began to arrive. Not invitations, demands. "I don't understand." Rosalind's father sat at the kitchen table, his hands shaking as he spread the papers before him. Harrington gave me until spring. He promised asterisk me until spring. And now he lifted a letter, then another, then another. Now they all want payment within the month, all of them, at once, as if someone told them to, Rosalind said quietly. Her father looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw the thing she feared most. Not anger, not even fear. Shame. What happened at that ball, Rosalind? She had not told him. She had come home that night, folded the torn gown into the bottom of her trunk, and said only that the Duke had been unavailable. But London's whispers climbed through every window, and her father was a broken man, not a deaf one. It doesn't matter what happened, Papa. They are saying a Duke laughed at my daughter. His voice cracked in the middle. They are saying 300 people laughed at my little girl in her mother's dress, and I sent her there. I sent you there, to pay for my failures. Papa, your mother would never forgive me. He pressed his trembling hand over his eyes. I will never forgive me. Papa, look at me. We will manage. We always manage. I'll write to Uncle James in the morning and... She never finished the sentence. Because that was the moment her father's face changed, the moment the left side of it slipped, like a candle leaning in the heat. The letter fell from his hand. He looked at her with sudden, terrible confusion, opened his mouth to say her name, and said nothing at all. Then he fell. The doctor cost money they did not have. The medicine cost more. Apoplexy, the doctor said, pulling on his coat while Rosalind counted coins into his palm, the last coins in the house. A stroke brought on by shock and strain. He may recover some speech, some movement, with rest, with warmth, with proper food and care. He glanced around the cold, bare room and had the decency to look uncomfortable. I'll return next week, if you wish. If you can pay, he meant. That night Rosalind sat by her father's bed and did the arithmetic of despair. The rent was due. The creditors were circling. Her father could not be moved, could not work, could not even hold a spoon. Uncle James had answered her letter with 3 sentences, the kindest of which was, I regret that my circumstances do not permit. There was one path left, and she knew where it led. She had seen other girls walk it. A position as a governess or a lady's companion, if anyone would hire the patchwork beggar. Her father in a charity ward. The slow, quiet disappearing of people whom London had decided not to see any more. She was still sitting there at dawn, dry-eyed and hollow, when someone knocked at the door. The man on the step was old, truly old, past 70, leaning on an ebony cane with a silver handle. His coat was plain but beautifully made, the way only very expensive things can be plain. His face was deeply lined, and gray with an illness she recognized at once, because she had learned that gray from watching her mother die. But his eyes were alive, sharp and quick and strangely kind. Miss Fairchild, he said, you won't remember me. The last time I saw you, you were 6 years old and you bit me. Rosalind blinked. I beg your pardon. On the hand, quite hard. I had told your father that a man should never mix friendship and business, and you apparently took offense on his behalf. The old man's mouth twitched. You were the only person in that room who was right. My name is Edward Grantham. Your father and I were young together a very long time ago. May I come in? I find I tire quickly these days, and what I have to say will take some sitting. Grantham. Even Rosalind knew the name. Everyone knew the name. Grantham ships, Grantham warehouses, Grantham money moving invisibly beneath half the commerce in England. People said the king himself had once asked Edward Grantham for a loan and been politely refused. She made him tea with the last of the tea. He drank it as if it were the finest he'd ever tasted, sitting across from her father's sickbed, and for a while he simply talked to her father softly, one-sidedly about boyhood things, rivers and horses and a schoolmaster they had both hated. And her father, who had not made a sound in 9 days, made a sound. Half a word, half a laugh. Rosalind had to turn to the window, so neither man would see her face. "Now then," Grantham set down his cup and looked at her. "I'll speak plainly, Miss Fairchild, because plain speech is the only luxury I have left. I am dying. My doctors give me a year, too, if I insult them by being stubborn. I have no children, no wife. My only living relative is a nephew, Cedric, who checks the newspapers every morning hoping to find my name among the deaths." He said it without bitterness, as a man states the weather. "I have spent 50 years building a fortune, and I find at the end that I built nothing else. No one to talk to, no one to read to me, no one who will sit with an old man and argue with him, which is the thing I miss most in the world. Everyone agrees with a rich man, Miss Fairchild. It is the loneliest thing on earth." "Mr. Grantham," Rosalind said carefully, "why are you here?" "Because I heard what happened at Ravenscroft House." The kindness in his eyes went cold, not toward her but toward something far away. "And because I knew your mother, and because when I made inquiries about your family's debts this week I found something that interested me, something wrong with them, but that is a conversation for another day." He leaned forward on his cane. "Miss Fairchild, I have a proposal. And I ask you to hear all of it before you throw me out, because it will sound mad, and it is not." "Very well. Marry me." The room went completely silent. Even the fire seemed to stop. "You are right," Rosalind said at last. "It sounds mad." "On paper," Grantham continued calmly. "A marriage in name, nothing more. I am an old man, and I want a companion, not a wife, and my honor on that. In return, your father moves to my house in Kent today, the best doctors in England. Your debts, all of them, settled by Friday. And you—" he paused, and for the first time the sharp old eyes softened. "You get a name, my dear. A name so heavy that no duke, no duchess, no ballroom in this country will ever dare laugh at you again. And when I die, which I will do as slowly as possible, to spite my nephew, everything I have built goes to you." "Why?" The word came out as a whisper. "Why me? You could have any." "Because you bit me, Miss Fairchild." He smiled, and 40 years fell off his face. "Because your father is the only man who ever told me the truth when it cost him. Because I am owed one last interesting conversation before I go, and I intend to have several hundred of them. And because—" the smile faded into something older and harder— "I do not like what was done to you. I have spent my whole life watching that world sneer at people like us, people who asterisk work, and I find that my last wish is a simple one. I wish to see what happens when they must bow to you instead." Rosalind looked at her father, asleep now, his ruined face peaceful for the first time in days. Then she looked at the old man with the ebony cane, and asked the question that would change everything. "When you say something is asterisk wrong with my father's debts, Mr. Grantham, what exactly do you mean?" Edward Grantham smiled. "Marry me, my dear," he said, "and we shall find out together." They were married on a gray Tuesday morning, in a small church in Kent, with her father in a wheeled chair as witness, and the vicar's wife as the other. London laughed, of course. London always laughed. "The patchwork beggar has sold herself to a dying merchant," the drawing rooms whispered. 70 if he's a day. Well, what else could she do after Ravenscroft? Rosalind heard it all eventually, and she found to her surprise that it no longer touched her. Words like that could only wound a woman who had something left to lose, and she had already lost everything once. Besides, she was too busy to bleed. Because Edward Grantham had not married a companion. He had taken on a student. It began on the third morning, at breakfast, when he slid a stack of shipping reports across the table. "Read those," he said, "and tell me which of my 3 captains is stealing from me." Rosalind stared at him. "Mr. Grantham, I wouldn't have the faintest idea how." Edward, and you have eyes, a brain, and no bad habits of thinking, which puts you ahead of every man in my counting house. Read them. Take all day. Take 2. It took her 4, but on the 4th evening she set the papers down and said, Captain Morris. His voyages take 3 days longer than the others on the same route. His storm damage happens even in calm months, and it always damages the same kind of cargo, the kind that's easiest to sell. The old man looked at her for a long moment over his spectacles. 11 days, he said at last. I'm sorry. It took my own solicitor 11 days to find what you found in 4. He gathered up the papers, and there was something in his face she had never seen directed at her before, pride. We start properly tomorrow. Wear comfortable shoes. And so it began. That first year, Rosalind learned more than in all her life before. She learned to read a ledger the way other women read novels, for the story hidden inside. She learned how money moved, how it hid, how it lied. Edward took her to the docks at dawn and taught her to judge a cargo by its smell. He took her to dinners and taught her to judge a man by how he treated the servants when he thought no one important was watching. Everyone lies with their mouth, he told her. Almost no one can lie with their hands, their eyes, and their money all at the same time. Watch all 3. Her father grew stronger in the Kent sunshine. His speech came back slowly, one word at a time, like birds returning after winter. Some evenings the 2 old men would sit by the fire, Edward talking, her father laboring out half sentences, both of them laughing at jokes 40 years old, and Rosalind would watch from the doorway and feel something she'd thought was gone for good. She felt safe. She should have known better. Safety, she would learn, is the quietest kind of warning. The nephew came at Christmas. Cedric Grantham was 40, soft-handed, and smelled of expensive cologne and cheap ambition. He kissed Rosalind's hand a moment too long, called her my dear new aunt with a smile that never reached his eyes, and spent the visit strolling through the house making a quiet inventory of everything in it. She could see him doing it, pricing the silver, the paintings, the very curtains. On the last evening, he found her alone in the library. You've done well for yourself, he said pleasantly, running a finger along the shelf. The patched gown, now all this. I do admire ambition in a woman truly. He turned, and the pleasantness fell away like a coat he was tired of wearing. But you should understand something. That old man upstairs can leave you trinkets, pin money, a cottage, whatever he likes. But everything that matters comes to me. Blood is blood, madam. The courts of England respect blood. Remember that when he's gone. Thank you, Cedric, Rosalind said calmly, not looking up from her book. I'll remember everything about this conversation. She told Edward that night. She expected anger. Instead, the old man laughed until he had to hold his side. Oh, wonderful, wonderful, he's threatening you already. He must be more worried than I thought. Then the laughter faded and he looked at her with the sharp old eyes that missed nothing. He will come after you, my dear, the moment I'm gone. You'll need to be ready, and you will be, because I'll make you ready, but there's something else you'll need before that. He was quiet for a moment. Something I've been putting off telling you. Not yet, but soon. Edward. Not yet, he said gently. Some things a man only says once, so he must choose the day well. The day came 2 winters later. He had grown thin by then, and slow, and the gray in his face had deepened, but the eyes never dimmed. On a cold February evening he asked her to bring the black lacquered box from his study, the one that was always locked, the one she had never asked about, and to sit by his bed. 2 things, he said, and then I'll rest. First. He opened the box with a small key he wore on a chain and drew out a bundle of papers, old and new together, tied in faded red ribbon. Do you know what these are? She read the first page, then read it again. Her hands went cold. These are debt bonds, loan papers. She looked up. Edward, these say *Ravenscroft. All of it, the old man said quietly. Every acre, every stone, every chandelier in that pretty ballroom where they laughed at you. The old duke, the current one's father, was a gambler and a fool. He borrowed from me for 30 years secretly through agents and lawyers so that no one in his shining world would ever know. When he died, the debts passed to his son. He tapped the bundle. Julian Ashworth smiles at 300 guests under chandeliers that belong, every crystal of them, to me. And here is the strange part, my dear. He doesn't know. His mother handled the family's affairs during his father's decline. The son signs what the solicitors put before him. He has no idea how deep the hole is or who holds the other end of the rope. Rosalind sat very still, the papers heavy as a sleeping animal in her lap. Why are you giving me this? Because everything I have becomes yours, and this is part of everything. What you do with it is your own affair. Burn them, collect them, frame them. But before you decide, you must hear the second thing. He took her hand, and his grip was suddenly strong, urgent, young. Rosalind, your father's ruin was not bad luck. The fire cracked in the silence. I told you once his debts looked wrong. I have spent 2 years and more money than I'll admit quietly pulling that thread. Notes he never signed, interest that doubled in the dark, letters sent to his creditors all in the same week, the week after that ball, telling them to call in everything at once. Someone built your father's fall, my dear, the way an engineer builds a bridge, carefully, on purpose. And then someone made very sure that the one man who could have saved him, the Duke of Ravenscroft, laughed at his daughter instead of listening to her. Who? Her voice didn't sound like her own. Edward who? I don't know. It clearly cost him to say it. Whoever it is buried themselves deep, and I ran out of, he smiled faintly, time, but I know this much. The trail doesn't lead to the docks or the counting houses. It leads asterisk up, Rosalind, into the drawing rooms, into the ballrooms. Whoever destroyed your father belongs to the very world that laughed at you, and you will never find them from the outside. His grip tightened. They have to open the doors themselves. They have to invite you in. And they only ever open those doors for 2 things, a title or a fortune. I couldn't give you the first, so I am giving you the second. He fell back against the pillows, spent, and for a while there was only the fire and the wind against the windows. Promise me something, he said at last, and his voice had gone soft, not weak, but soft the way it went only when he spoke to her father. When you go back into that world, and you will, don't let it turn you into one of them. Be angry. Anger is honest. But my whole life I collected debts, my dear, and I'll tell you the one thing I learned at the end of it. His eyes were already half closing. The only debt that ever ruined anyone was the one they wouldn't forgive. Edward Grantham died 11 days later, in his sleep, with her father dozing in the chair beside him and Rosalind holding his hand. The will was read on a Thursday. Cedric arrived smiling in a new coat. He left in silence, white to the lips. Everything, the ships, the warehouses, the houses, the gold, and one black lacquered box tied with faded red ribbon, went to my wife, my student, and the finest mind I ever had the honor to argue with, Rosalind Grantham. And 1 year later, on an autumn evening, the doors of Ravenscroft House swung open, and a footman's voice rang out over 300 of the finest heads in London. For 3 years, the Duke of Ravenscroft had been haunted by a laugh. His own. It came to him at strange hours, in the middle of a card game, at the opera between movements. Standing in his own ballroom while the orchestra tuned, he would suddenly hear it again, that short, hollow sound that had left his mouth on an October night, and see a girl in a patched gown curtsying in the middle of a laughing crowd. "Thank you, Your Grace. You have taught me more tonight than 6 months ever could." He had tried to find her. That was the thing no one knew. 2 weeks after that ball, 2 weeks too late, after the shame had finally shouted louder than his mother, he had ridden to the address his solicitor found. The rooms were empty. The Fairchilds were gone, the landlord said, gone with the debts and the sick old man, gone the way poor people go. without a forwarding address because no one ever intends to write. His mother had been delighted. Vanished, good. Then the matter is closed, Julian. The matter was not closed. The matter sat behind his ribs like a splinter. Much had changed in 3 years, and none of it kindly. His engagement to the Holloway heiress had collapsed. Her family had withdrawn suddenly, without explanation, taking their fortune with them. His mother blamed him. He suspected, without proof, that she blamed him for a great many things she had arranged herself. And beneath it all, beneath the chandeliers and the liveried footmen and the 700 acres of green England that carried his name, ran a truth known only to the family solicitor and the Dowager Duchess. Ravenscroft was drowning. He had discovered it in pieces, a mortgage here, a loan there, papers signed during his father's last years, papers his mother had managed and he had never questioned. Every quarter sums vanished to lawyers he had never met, servicing debts he could not trace to any single lender. When he demanded answers, his mother would press her lips together and say, "Your father's affairs were complicated. I protected you from them. I am still protecting you. Marry money, Julian, and none of it will matter." So he threw balls he could not afford, to court heiresses he did not want, in a house that, though he did not know it, no longer truly belonged to him. And then, on an autumn evening exactly 3 years after the laugh, the doors of his ballroom opened, and his footman called out a name that stopped the music in his blood. Mrs. Rosalind Grantham, widow of the late Mr. Edward Grantham. He knew her instantly. That was the strange thing. She looked nothing like the girl in the patched gown. That girl had been thin and pale and burning with desperate hope. This woman was composed the way a drawn sword is composed. Midnight silk, diamonds like frost. She crossed his ballroom through a canyon of silence, and 300 people who had laughed at her once now bent and bowed and murmured like wheat in the wind, because London never remembers its cruelties, only its fortunes. Grantham's widow, the Grantham, they say she doubled his shipping interest herself. They say she refused the Earl of Weymouth. They say. She stopped in front of him. "Your Grace," her voice was soft, almost gentle, "I believe you once found my gown amusing." Up close, her eyes were exactly as he remembered, and they held his without a flicker. Julian Ashworth had faced angry men, dueling men, dying men. He had never in his life found it so difficult to hold a gaze. "Mrs. Grantham," his voice came out lower than he intended, "you are welcome in this house." "Am I?" A small smile. "How things change." Rosalind Fairchild. The Dowager Duchess materialized at his elbow the way she always did, purple silk and pearls and a smile with nothing behind it. "Or Grantham, I suppose we must say now. What a remarkable elevation. Your late husband was, forgive me my memory, in trade, was he not?" "He was, Your Grace." Rosalind turned to the older woman pleasantly. "Ships, warehouses, loans." She let the last word rest in the air a moment longer than the others, and Julian saw, he was certain he saw, something flicker behind his mother's smile. It's astonishing, really, how much of the finest society floats on borrowed water, but you would know more of such things than I, Your Grace. You strike me as a woman who manages her affairs thoroughly. I'm sure I don't take your meaning." "I'm sure you will." Rosalind smiled, curtsied with perfect grace, the same slow, flawless curtsy, and Julian felt the memory of it go through him like a blade and turned to the room. "What a lovely ball, Your Grace. The chandeliers are magnificent. I do hope you'll take good care of them." Then she was gone, absorbed into the crowd that had once spat her out, and every ambitious mother and hungry-eyed gentleman in London closed around the richest widow in England like water around a stone. "Insolent creature," the Dowager said quietly. "Trade money, she'll be forgotten in a season." But Julian was watching his mother's hands. They were trembling. He did not sleep that night. He stood at the tall window of his study, the same window where he had once watched a girl in a torn gown disappear into the dark, and turned a small piece of ivory silk over and over in his fingers. It lived in the top drawer of his desk, that scrap of fabric. It had lived there for 3 years. He had never been able to explain to himself why he'd picked it up off the steps that night, or why he'd kept it, or why, on the worst evenings, his hand went to that drawer the way other men's hands went to brandy. "You have taught me more tonight than 6 months ever could." 6 months. He had learned later what she'd come for, 6 months' grace on her father's debts. He could have granted it with a word. It would have cost him nothing less than the champagne served that evening. Instead, he had laughed, and then the world had done to the Fairchilds what the world does. There was a knock. His solicitor, Mr. Pratt, stood in the doorway at 2 o'clock in the morning, gray-faced, holding a letter as if it were a live coal. "Forgive the hour, Your Grace. This was delivered to my office this evening by private courier. I judged it could not wait." Julian read it once, then again. The words did not change. "To His Grace, the Duke of Ravenscroft **. Sir, I write on behalf of my client, who has recently come into possession, by lawful inheritance, of the complete obligations of the Ravenscroft estate, comprising 4 mortgages, 11 promissory notes, and sundry instruments of debt executed by the late Duke and by the present Duchess Dowager, amounting in total to a sum I would encourage Your Grace to sit down before reading on the enclosed schedule. My client wishes me to convey that no immediate demand is made. My client wishes, first, simply to meet. My client will receive Your Grace on Thursday, at 11 o'clock, at Grantham House." Julian lowered the letter. The room seemed to tilt very slowly around him. Chandelier and bookshelves, and 300 years of Ashworth portraits all sliding toward a single, impossible point. "The complete obligations," he said. "All asterisk of it. One person holds all of it. Pratt, we don't even know the full sum ourselves, my mother's papers." "One person, Your Grace." The solicitor swallowed. "The schedule is comprehensive, more comprehensive than our own records. Whoever assembled this knows the estate's affairs better than we do." Who? But even as he asked it, his eyes found the bottom of the letter, and the world finished tilting. The name was written in a firm, elegant hand. "On behalf of Mrs. Rosalind Grantham." Somewhere in the dark house, a clock struck the half-hour. Julian Ashworth stood very still, holding in one hand the letter that placed his entire world in the palm of a woman he had once destroyed with a laugh. And in the other hand, without quite realizing it, a small patch of ivory silk. Grantham House did not look like a rich man's house. That was the first thing Julian noticed, standing on the step at 11 o'clock on Thursday morning. No gilded gates, no army of footmen, no marble lions. Just a large, handsome, quiet house with very good windows. The kind of house, he realized uncomfortably, that didn't need to convince anyone of anything. Unlike his own. A butler showed him not to a drawing room but to a study. And there, behind a great oak desk covered in papers she had clearly been working on, not arranged for effect, but actually working on, sat Rosalind Grantham, in gray morning silk, with ink on the side of her left hand. "Your Grace, sit down, please." Not "won't you sit," not "may I offer you tea." Sit down, please, the way one speaks to a man who has come about a debt, which, Julian reminded himself, gripping the arm of the chair as he lowered himself into it, was precisely what he was. "Mrs. Grantham, before we begin I must say something, and I ask you to let me finish." He had rehearsed this at the window at 4 in the morning. "What happened 3 years ago in my house was unforgivable. I have no excuse to offer you. I was a coward in front of 300 people, and you paid for my cowardice, and there has not been a week since, I swear this before God, that I have not regretted." "Stop." She said it quietly without heat, and it stopped him like a wall. She set down her pen. "Your Grace, let us understand one another because it will save us both a great deal of time. I did not come back to London for your apology. Apologies are like banknotes. Anyone can write one, and their value depends entirely on the bank behind them. At present, sir, your bank stands empty." She drew a single sheet from the stack and slid it across the desk. "In every sense." Julian looked down. He had expected a large number. He had braced for a large number. But the figure at the bottom of that page was not a number, it was a verdict. It was his stables and his hunting lodge, his mother's pearls and his father's portraits, his town house and Ravenscroft itself, the park, the farms, the village, the chandeliers, all of it, converted into ink, and underneath it all, one line that made his blood stop. Total obligations exceed the certified value of the estate. That cannot be right. His voice sounded far away. That would mean that you are ruined. Yes. She said it the way Edward would have, plainly, without cruelty, without mercy. You have been ruined for some time, Your Grace. You simply hadn't been introduced. Your father borrowed for 30 years through agents, so his world would never know. After his health failed, the borrowing continued, new loans to pay the interest on the old ones, a hole dug deeper to fill it. My late husband bought the debts quietly over the years as they came onto the market. He held the entire estate in that box for a decade and never called in a penny of it. Why? I asked him that once. Something crossed her face, the first human thing he'd seen in it that morning. He said a debt is like a fish. You don't pull the line at the first bite. You wait until you know what's on the other end. She looked at him steadily. He died before he found out, so the line came to me. Julian rose and walked to the window, because a man cannot sit still while his whole life is rearranged behind his back. Outside, ordinary London went by: carts, a nursemaid, a boy chasing a dog, a world that had no idea it was passing beneath the window where the Duke of Ravenscroft was ending. "So this is the meeting," he said finally. "You've brought me here to tell me your calling and the debts. Ravenscroft to the auction block. 300 years sold in an afternoon. And I suppose," he turned, and to his own surprise there was no anger in him, only a terrible tiredness. "I suppose I cannot even blame you. If I stood where you stand, madam, holding what you hold, remembering what you remember, I would do the same." "No, you wouldn't," Rosalind said. "You'd hesitate for 3 years first. It seems to be your way." The blow landed so precisely that he almost laughed, a real laugh this time, bitter and at his own expense. "Yes," he said, "it seems to be." "Sit down, Your Grace. I'm not calling in your debts." He turned from the window very slowly. "What?" "Not today, not this year. Perhaps, depending entirely on you, not ever." She folded her hands on the desk. "I am proposing an arrangement. You will find my terms strange. I advise you not to ask too many questions about them because I will not answer and we will waste the morning." "Name them." "1 season. From now until summer, you, the Duke of Ravenscroft, first gentleman of this county, darling of every hostess in London, will present me to society, personally. You will secure my invitation to every ball, every dinner, every salon and garden party and musical evening that matters. You will dance with me where it will be seen. You will introduce me to the old families, the Pelhams, the Wyndhams, the Harcourts, all of them. You will open every door in London that has a crest on it, and you will stand beside me while I walk through. In public, you will treat me as the most welcome woman in England." She paused. "Which, given what I hold in that box, I am." Julian stared at her. Of all the demands he had imagined writing here, the money, the house, a public apology on his knees in that same ballroom, this had not been among them. "You want invitations," he said. "Madam, you're the richest widow in the country. Half of London is already clawing at your door." "Half of London wants my money. I require the *other half. The half that never opens its doors to trade money, no matter how much of it there is. The old half, the quiet half, the rooms your mother sits in. Her voice didn't change when she said it, but something in the air did. Those rooms open for two things only, your grace, a title, or the arm of one. You will be the arm. Why? He leaned forward. You said you didn't come back for my apology, and I believe you. And I can see this is not vanity. You wear those rooms' contempt like a comfortable coat. So why? What does a woman who owns half of England's shipping want in a drawing room full of people she despises? For a moment, just a moment, Rosalind looked at him with something that was almost respect. It was a better question than anyone had asked her in a year. You were told not to ask, she said. Those are my terms. A season of doors, your grace, and the debts sleep. Refuse and they wake. You may take a day to consider. I accept. Or not, she finished dryly. I accept, Julian said again, and stood, and found to his own astonishment that his heart was beating like a man walking out of a courtroom acquitted, or perhaps like a man walking into one. On one condition of my own. You are in no position to make conditions. Nevertheless, he met her eyes. Somewhere in this house, I am told, lives Mr. Thomas Fairchild. Before I leave, I should like 5 minutes with him. Not to be forgiven, I know better. I owe that man a sentence I have owed for 3 years, and I'd rather be ruined than owe it a day longer. Silence. The clock on the mantel counted it out. He tires quickly, Rosalind said at last, and her voice was not quite the same voice. 5 minutes. And if you upset him, your grace, I promise you, the auction notices go up on Monday. She watched from the doorway of her father's sunlit room as the Duke of Ravenscroft, the man whose laugh had broken their lives, bowed low over her father's chair, and said, quietly and completely, the sentence he had carried for 3 years. She watched her father study him for a long, long moment with his tired, clever eyes. And she watched, with a strange tightness in her chest, as her father slowly lifted his good hand and gestured at the chessboard by the window. Papa, she began. He asked for 5 minutes. Her father's words came slow and stubborn as always. I intend to take considerably longer beating him. That was the afternoon the bargain began. Rosalind told herself it was strategy. Every door in London, and behind one of those doors, the person who had destroyed her family. She had a plan, and the plan was perfect. What she did not have, what no plan survives, was an answer for the sound that reached her an hour later, down the corridor from a sunlit room, her father laughing, truly laughing, at something the Duke had said. London had never seen anything quite like it. The Duke of Ravenscroft, proud, distant, unreachable Ravenscroft, appeared that season with the widow Grantham on his arm, and the drawing rooms nearly caught fire from the friction of turning heads. He danced with her at the Pelham Ball. He sat beside her at the opera. He drove her through Hyde Park at the fashionable hour, twice in 1 week, and on the second occasion he was seen to laugh at something she said, actually laugh, said the witnesses, as if he were a person. The old families were scandalized. The old families were fascinated. And because the Duke vouched for her, the old families did the only thing they could do. They opened their doors. Which was, of course, the entire point. Rosalind walked through those doors the way Edward had taught her to walk through a warehouse, smiling, unhurried and counting everything. At every dinner she listened. In every drawing room she asked one innocent question and let vanity do the rest, because the aristocracy, she discovered, would guard a diamond with their lives but would hand you their secrets with the fish course. Slowly, evening by evening, she gathered threads. Who had known her father, who had done business with him, who had gone strangely quiet in the autumn her family fell. That was the plan. The plan was working. The problem was the Duke. The problem began, she later decided, at the Wyndham Musicale, 3 weeks into the season. A soprano was mangling an aria. The room was hot, and beside her the Duke of Ravenscroft, who was obliged by their bargain to sit there, leaned over and murmured, "I feel I should apologize again." "You've exhausted your apologies, Your Grace." "Not for the past, for Signora Bellini." A pause. "The cat that lives in my stables produces this exact sound, but only when stepped on and never for this long." Rosalind bit the inside of her cheek and stared straight ahead. She would not laugh. She had sworn a private oath, somewhere between the first ball and the second, that this man would never once see her laugh. It was becoming a demanding oath to keep. Because the Duke of Ravenscroft, at close range, was not the man she had built in her memory. That man had been marble and contempt. This one noticed when a footman's arm trembled under a heavy tray and shifted the dishes himself without a word. This one knew the name of every groom in his stables and the names of their children. This one she learned from Charlotte, dear, loyal Charlotte, restored to her side and gleefully gathering intelligence, had quietly paid for the schooling of his late valet's sons, and threatened his solicitor with dismissal should anyone ever hear of it. "It doesn't excuse the laugh," Charlotte said, watching her friend's face carefully. "No," Rosalind said, "it doesn't." But she was beginning to understand the laugh, and that was worse. Because the more evenings she spent in society, the more she saw the Dowager Duchess at work. The iron glance across a room that could stop her son mid-sentence, the small corrections delivered like knife cuts under the cover of pleasantries. "Julian, you forget yourself." "Julian, people are watching." "Julian, 40 years of that voice." Rosalind watched the Duke's shoulders stiffen at it, watched him obey it out of a habit older than his own will, and understood, with unwelcome clarity, that she was looking at a man who had spent his whole life inside a smaller cage than any she'd ever been poor in. Understanding is a dangerous thing. Anger needs distance, and understanding kept closing it. Then came the matter of Dr. Everett. It surfaced by accident on a rainy Tuesday in the most ordinary way. Her father's physician, the excellent, expensive Dr. Everett, who had attended him in Kent through all the Grantham years, mentioned in passing that he would need to adjust his account, now that the other arrangement has ended. Rosalind looked up from her letters. What other arrangement? The doctor blinked. "The standing arrangement, madam, the annual sum for Mr. Fairchild's care." And then, seeing her face, "Oh dear, I had assumed, madam, I had always assumed you knew." It took her 3 days and one uncomfortable interview with the doctor's clerk to assemble the truth. Since the winter after her family's fall, beginning mere weeks after that October ball, a sum had been paid every year, through a lawyer, from an unnamed party, for the medical care of Mr. Thomas Fairchild, wherever he should reside. The payments had followed her father from London to Kent without a single year's interruption. They had continued straight through her marriage, when the Granthams could buy every doctor in England, quietly redundant, quietly faithful. They had stopped only this spring. "Stopped why?" Rosalind demanded. The clerk consulted his ledger. "The instruction was withdrawn in March, madam. The client's note is here, no longer needed. She can care for him better than I ever did." "And the client's name?" "Withheld, madam. It was always withheld. That was the one absolute condition." She told herself it was Edward. It would be like Edward, except that it had begun 2 years before Edward entered her life, in the very weeks when the Fairchilds had vanished from London, leaving no address, when someone would have had to search to find where a ruined man and his daughter had gone. Someone with lawyers, someone with reach, someone with a reason. She said nothing to the Duke, but at the Harcourt ball that Friday she watched him across the room bowing over the hand of a dowager countess, wearing the polite, absent smile he wore like armor, and she caught herself doing the arithmetic. March. The instruction withdrawn in March. She had returned to London, rich beyond argument at the end of February. No longer needed. She can care for him better than I ever did. You're staring at him, Charlotte murmured over her fan. I am cataloging his faults. Of course, how many have you found? One, Rosalind said quietly. He makes it very difficult to keep hating him. It is his worst quality by far. But the season had a second face, and she never let herself forget it. Because the threads she was gathering in those glittering rooms had finally begun to twist together. An old banker, made talkative by port, remembered something odd from 3 years ago. Paper against Thomas Fairchild's name, sold suddenly and cheap, all in 1 week, all through the same little lawyer Finch, Flint, no, Sparrow. Odd little man, never knew who he acted for. A dowager recalled that the Halloway family, the family whose heiress had been meant for the Duke, had broken the engagement that same autumn after, receiving a letter about the Ravenscroft finances, though no one living would say from whom. And in the study of Lord Harcourt himself, hanging bold as brass among the hunting prints, Rosalind found a framed, faded invitation to a house party of 20 years past, and among the signatures of the guests, 2 names written side by side, in a familiarity that made her stand very still with her wine untasted. Cornelius Grantham, Cedric's late father. And beneath it, in a hand she had seen on 100 stiff, cream-colored cards that season, Adelaide Ashworth, the Dowager Duchess of Ravenscroft. It proved nothing. Old families knew old families. A signature was not a sin. And yet all the way home in the carriage, Edward's voice kept turning over in her mind like a key trying a lock. The trail leads up, Rosalind, into the drawing rooms. Whoever destroyed your father belongs to the very world that laughed at you. The carriage passed Ravenscroft House. There was a light in the study window. He kept absurd hours. She had learned, wrestling alone with the estate's ruined books, too proud to ask her what she already knew about them. She watched the lit window until the carriage turned the corner, and she made herself say it aloud, alone in the dark, because the words were getting quieter every week, and she was afraid of the day she wouldn't be able to hear them at all. He laughed. Whatever else is true, he laughed. The words came out obediently. For the first time, they sounded like someone else's voice. Afterward, Rosalind would remember that the worst day of the season began as the best. It began in the morning with roses. Not hothouse roses. Every fortune hunter in London sent her those by the cartload. These were small, half-wild briar roses, still damp, in a plain jar, with a card in a hand she now knew as well as her own. From the hedgerows at Ravenscroft. My mother has had the gardens redone twice at ruinous expense, but these grow by the east wall where no one planned them, and they outlive everything. They have always been my favorites. They remind me of no one in particular. R. She read the card 3 times. She put it in a drawer. She took it out and read it again. Then she informed her reflection, with great firmness, that briar roses changed nothing, that a man's regret was not a woman's obligation, and that she had an appointment in one of the ugliest streets in London. Because after 5 weeks of patient hunting, she had found Mr. Sparrow. The odd little lawyer had not been easy to find. He had shut his practice 2 years ago and retreated to 2 rented rooms above a chandler's shop, where he lived, as far as Rosalind could discover, on gin and the fear of God. He was small and gray and trembling, and when she told him her name, her first name, her father's name, he sat down as if his legs had been taken from under him. "Fairchild," he whispered. Oh, I knew one day somebody would come." "Then you know why. 3 years ago, Mr. Sparrow, somebody used you to buy my father's debts and call them in all in 1 week. Somebody sent letters. Somebody paid you to hide their name." She laid a banknote on the table between them. It was more than the room, the shop, and possibly the street were worth. "I am not here for the law. I am here for the name." The little man stared at the note, and then, to her astonishment, pushed it away. "Keep your money, madam. I'll give you the file for nothing. I've kept it 3 years, God help me, told myself it was security, but it wasn't, it was conscience, sitting in a box, ticking." He dragged a battered case from under the bed, and his hands shook so badly she had to work the lock herself. "I never met the principal. Never once. Instructions came sealed, payment came clean." But instructions have to be signed, madam, and seals have to be pressed, and a man in my former profession learns to keep what passes through his hands. It's all there. The whole cruel business, and I'll tell you what I told my maker every night since. But Rosalind had stopped listening. Because the file was open and the letters were in her hands, the letters that had ended her world. Call in all Fairchild paper at once. Press the physician for immediate payment. See that no house in the parish extends the family credit. Line after line of quiet, methodical destruction, written in a secretary's neat hand. And at the bottom of each page, pressed into black wax, a raven, wings spread above a crown. The Ravenscroft seal. And beneath the seal, each time, a signature, not a secretary's. Firm, angular, unmistakable, she had seen it that very morning, on a card in a jar of briar roses. Ashworth. The room went very quiet, and very cold and very far away. "Madam," Mr. Sparrow's voice reached her as if through water. "Madam, will you take a chair? You've gone white as paper." "The dates," her own voice came out flat and strange. "Read me the date of the first instruction." He fumbled for his spectacles. The 9th of October, madam, of that year." The 9th of October. The ball had been on the 6th. 3 days. He had laughed at her on a Wednesday, and on the Saturday he had picked up a pen and made sure the girl in the patched gown could never come back to embarrass him again. Her father, the whole inconvenient family, swept off London's board like crumbs off a table. And now, 3 years later, cornered by the debts she held, he sent roses. He played chess with the broken old man he had broken. He makes it very difficult to keep hating him. It is his worst quality by far. It was not a quality, she thought, with a calm that frightened her. It was a method. She did not remember the carriage ride home. She remembered only that Grantham House had a visitor waiting, and that the visitor was the last person on earth she wished to see. And as the drawing-room door opened, the only person who could have made the day complete. The Dowager Duchess of Ravenscroft rose from the best chair, unasked and uninvited, magnificent in gray silk, and did not waste time on pleasantries. "Mrs. Grantham, I'll be brief. We neither of us enjoy the other's company. I have come because you are a woman of business and because, whatever else you are, I don't believe you are a fool." She drew a folded letter from her reticule. "My son believes he is being subtle. He forgets who taught him. I found this in his study a week ago, a draft in his own hand of a letter to an old school friend. I suggest you read it sitting down, though I note you people rarely take suggestions." Rosalind took the letter standing. The hand was Julian's, the same strong, angular writing as the rose card in her drawer, as the signature on the instructions in her carriage. The words were worse than anything Sparrow's file held, because these words were warm, easy, amused. A gentleman writing to a friend. "You ask how I endure the season. Patience, George, the same way one endures any occupation, by keeping the wages in view. The widow softens by the week. She is clever, but clever women are the easiest of all because they cannot resist believing that a man has finally seen them. A few more balls, a little more remorse. I have become rather good at remorse, and the debts will be ashes by summer, the papers burned by her own sentimental hand. After that the merchant's daughter may keep her ships and her warehouses and her tradesmen's money, and I shall keep Ravenscroft, and we need never sit through another soprano together. Endure her, my dear fellow. I laughed at that gown once for nothing. This time, at least, I am being paid." Somewhere in the room a clock was ticking. Somewhere the dowager was still speaking, something about discretion, about her son's necessary marriage, about generous terms for the return of certain papers, but Rosalind heard none of it. She stood in the center of the beautiful drawing room Edward's money had built, holding the letter, and felt with a kind of distant wonder the exact sensation of 3 years ago, the center of a laughing world in a gown that had fooled no one. Clever women are the easiest of all, because they cannot resist believing that a man has finally seen them. She had been the richest widow in England for 1 year, and a fool for 5 weeks. "I see this distresses you," the dowager said, and there was satisfaction in it, poorly hidden like a knife under a napkin. "I'll leave you to compose yourself. Consider what I've said about the papers, and Mrs. Grantham a small kindness from a woman who knows the world. Do not blame yourself excessively. My son is an Ashworth." She smoothed her gloves. "Charm is the family trade. It has never once come free." The door closed behind her with a soft, expensive click. Rosalind stood alone for a long time. Then she crossed to the drawer, took out the card that had come with the briar roses. "They outlive everything. They remind me of no one in particular," and set it side by side with the letter, and the two hands matched, stroke for stroke, and something in her chest that had been quietly, foolishly reopening for 5 weeks closed like a fist. When her maid came in at dusk to light the lamps, she found her mistress at Edward's great desk, dry-eyed, writing in a firm, steady hand. 3 letters already sealed, one to her solicitor, one to her banker, one to the auctioneers. "Shall I send for supper, madam?" "No." Rosalind pressed the Grantham seal into the last black wax, and her voice was the voice of the woman who had walked into a silent ballroom in midnight silk. "Send for the carriage at 9 tomorrow, and lay out the gray dress, the one for business." She looked down at the sealed letters, and the fire caught the cold shine in her eyes. "The Duke of Ravenscroft is about to learn," she said quietly, "exactly how much his laugh cost." The notices went out on a Thursday, 1 year to the week since a footman had announced the widow Grantham into a silent ballroom. By order of the holder of the obligations of the Ravenscroft estate, collection is demanded in full. In default thereof, the estate and its contents shall proceed to public auction. London gasped, and then London feasted. The Duke's ruin was the scandal of the decade, and the drawing rooms that had bowed to Rosalind all season now trembled deliciously over their teacups. She held his debts all along. The whole courtship, my dear, the patience of the woman. 3 years, like a cat at a mouse hole. The Duke of Ravenscroft came to Grantham House within the hour of the first notice. Rosalind knew because she watched from the upstairs window as he was refused at her door, watched him stand bareheaded in the street, staring up at the house, a man who had clearly ridden without a coat or a thought. He came again that afternoon. He was refused again. He wrote 4 letters. She burned them unopened, and if her hand hesitated over the 4th, the fire never told. On the 3rd day, he did the unforgivable. He came while she was leaving her solicitor's office, and simply stood in her path on the public pavement, so that she must either speak to him or be seen to flee. "You will tell me why." His voice was low and raw. He had not slept, that was plain. "You owe me nothing, madam, God knows, but you are not cruel and you are never senseless, and this is both. 3 days ago he stopped, mastered himself. What has happened? What have I done?" He was good. That was the thing she could not get past, how good he was. The confusion looked real. The hurt looked real. The briar roses had looked real. "The 9th of October, Rosalind said. 3 years ago. Does the date mean anything to you, your grace?" "The 9th of," he searched her face, utterly lost. "That autumn. The ball was the 6th. Rosalind, I don't." "No, of course you don't." She smiled, and knew from the way he flinched that it was Edward's smile, the one for a man caught with false papers. "You know, your mother did me a kindness this week. The only honest sentence your family ever gave me, Charm is the family trade, she said. It has never once come free. She stepped around him. The auction is in 6 weeks, Your Grace. I suggest you spend them packing. My mother. He said it very quietly behind her, and something in his voice had changed. The hurt had gone out of it, and something colder and more careful had come in. You spoke with my mother. Rosalind did not turn around. If she had, she would have seen a man standing very still on a London pavement, no longer looking at her at all, but through her, past her, at something taking shape in the air, a man beginning, for the first time in his life, to do sums he had been raised never to attempt. But she did not turn around. It was the last time they would speak as free people. The blow fell on the steps of the opera, because Cedric Grantham had always understood theater. It was the height of the interval crowd, half of society on the staircase, diamonds and gossip glittering under the great lamps, when the 2 men in dark coats made their way to the richest widow in England, and with terrible courtesy, in voices pitched to Carrie, served her. Mrs. Rosalind Grantham, by order of the Court of Chancery, madam, you are summoned to answer the petition of Mr. Cedric Grantham, contesting the last will and testament of Edward Grantham, deceased, on grounds of undue influence, fraud, and coercion of a dying man. The staircase went silent, tier by tier, like candles being pinched out. The petitioner further deposing that the marriage itself was procured by design upon an infirm and isolated gentleman, that the deceased's physicians were selected and instructed by the respondent, and that the court is petitioned to inquire into the asterisk circumstances and swiftness of the deceased's final decline. Someone dropped a glass. Somewhere above, a woman said quite clearly into the silence, "They're saying she killed him." Rosalind stood on the marble stairs in her midnight silk, in the heart of the world she had conquered, and watched it turn, not slowly, not gradually, but all at once, the way ice breaks. The faces that had fawned all season closed like doors. A countess she had dined with twice drew back her skirts an inch, no more. An inch is enough. And rising through the crowd came the whisper, finding its shape, its teeth, its joy, the same joy she had heard once before under different chandeliers. The patchwork beggar, first the gown, then the merchant, then the duke. My dear, women like that don't marry dying men for conversation. Cedric himself was on the landing above. He caught her eye, and he smiled, and raised his glass 1 small private inch. Blood is blood, madam. The courts of England respect blood. What followed was swifter than any ruin she had studied in Edward's ledgers. Within a week, the court froze the Grantham estate in its entirety, pending judgment, the ships, the warehouses, the accounts, and with them, in one stroke of a clerk's pen, the Ravenscroft debts and the auction itself. Her weapons were sealed in a courthouse basement. Her invitation stopped like a heart. The tradesmen who had begged for her custom now required, with 1,000 apologies, payment in coin. And Cedric had built well. She saw the architecture of it now, too late, with a professional's bitter admiration. A nurse from Edward's last months, ready to swear her mistress had kept the family away, controlled the doctors, hurried the medicines. A dismissed footman with a grudge and a new coat. The marriage in a small Kent church, so quick, so quiet, how sinister the happiest day could be made to sound, read aloud by a lawyer. Even her competence turned against her. A woman who understood ledgers and loans, my lords. A woman who studied the dying man's fortune for 2 years. Was that a wife, or an apprentice waiting for the shop? They cannot win, Charlotte said fiercely, Charlotte, who still came, the only one who still came, sailing through the empty street to Grantham House with her chin out like a figurehead. It's lies, all of it, stitched together. No court will believe. The court doesn't need to believe, Charlotte. It only needs to inquire. Rosalind stood at the window. Below, at the corner, the same 2 men had loitered for a week, watching her door for the court. Inquiry is the sentence. It will take a year, perhaps 2. And every morning of it, Every newspaper in England will print the words asterisk the Grantham widow and the old man's death in the same sentence, until no verdict on earth can unsay it. She laughed a short, hollow sound, and she recognized it with a strange, distant horror as the cousin of a laugh she had heard once in a ballroom. Do you know the truly elegant part? I spent 3 years learning to fight their world with money, so they have simply taken the money. I am the girl in the patched gown again, Charlotte. Except this time they haven't left me my father's name to lose. They're taking Edward's too. That was the night the last blow fell, the quiet one, the one that broke her. Her father had insisted on the newspapers all week. Forbidding him had only made him fierce. But that evening, the paper printed the nurse's deposition in full, and Rosalind came into the sunlit room to find it fallen from his good hand, and the old man weeping, struggling with his ruined mouth, through the only sentence he could shape. My fault, ball my fault, the dress my fault, all of it began with me. She held him until he slept. Then she went down alone to Edward's study, where one lamp was lit, and sat at the great desk. And for the first time since an October night 3 years ago, Rosalind put her face in her hands. She did not hear the study door. She only heard, after a while, the voice, hoarse, quiet and impossible, coming from the doorway where the butler she'd have sworn was loyal had let someone pass, because even loyal men can recognize a thing that will not be stopped. They served me with the inquiry papers this morning, said the Duke of Ravenscroft. I'm named as a witness for Cedric. Rosalind lifted her head. He stood in the lamplight, hat in hand, and he looked as ruined as she felt, but his eyes were steady and cold and absolutely awake, and in his other hand was a folded paper. They want me to testify that you confessed the scheme to me during our season. In exchange, he lifted the paper slightly, every Ravenscroft debt returned and burned, my estate, my name, everything back for 1 hour of lying about you. He crossed the room and laid the paper on the desk before her, face up. It's my mother's handwriting, Rosalind. Look at it. Look at it carefully, asterisk. Rosalind looked at the paper on the desk, and then at the man who had brought it. Sit down, Your Grace. They sat on opposite sides of Edward's great desk, ruin facing ruin, and between them, in the lamplight, Rosalind laid out 3 documents like a hand of cards. The bribe in the dowager's writing, every note returned, every mortgage burned, in exchange for the truth about that woman. The letter to George, warm, amused, monstrous. And from the locked drawer, Sparrow's file, the instructions that had destroyed her father, sealed with the raven and crown, signed Ashworth asterisk, dated the 9th of October. She watched Julian's face as he read. She had grown very good at watching faces. Edward had seen to that. And what she saw was a man reading his own handwriting on words he had never written, which is a particular kind of horror, like hearing your own voice confess to a murder in the next room. I don't have a friend named George, he said at last, very quietly. I have never had a friend named George, and this, his finger stopped on the October instructions and stayed there, Rosalind, on the 9th of October that year I was in Scotland. I left the morning after the ball. I couldn't, he stopped. I couldn't stay in that house. I rode north for 2 weeks and told no one why. Handwriting can travel by post. Signatures don't need their owners. No, he said. They don't. That's precisely the point. He pulled the lamp closer and laid the rose card. She had not known he'd seen it there among the papers, and something crossed his face when he touched it beside the forged letter. Look at the capital R here on the card. The leg kicks left. It has kicked left since I was 11 years old when I broke my right wrist falling off a horse called Hector, and it healed crooked, and I had to relearn my letters around it. Now look at the forgeries. His finger moved. The leg kicks right asterisk. Every R, everyone. That is my hand, Rosalind, but it is my hand as it was before Hector asterisk. It is my hand as remembered by the person who taught it to me, letter by letter with a ruler across my knuckles when I was 7. The lamp hissed softly in the silence. "Your mother," Rosalind said. "My mother." He said the word the way a surgeon names a disease. "Who has managed the estate since my father's decline, who puts papers in front of me and turns them face down when I've signed, whose oldest friend in the world." He drew a breath. "I did some sums of my own this week after you mentioned her on that pavement. I went through my father's study. 30 years of secret borrowing, Rosalind. Everyone said it was his gambling. My father didn't gamble. I never once saw him touch a card, but every loan was arranged through agents, and every agent's fee was paid through the same discreet little lawyer." His eyes came up. "A man called Sparrow." The clock on the mantel ticked 10 times before Rosalind trusted her voice. "Cornelius Grantham," she said. "Edward's brother, Cedric's father. There's a framed invitation in Lord Harcourt's study, 20 years old. His signature is directly beside your mother's." She was moving now, pulling Edward's old files, the ones she'd read a dozen times without the key. Edward was estranged from his brother his whole life. He never told me why, only that Cornelius's great shipping venture collapsed 20 years ago and ruined half the gentlemen in 3 counties, and that the money was never found. Never found * Julian. And in those same years, someone was quietly pouring borrowed Ravenscroft money into ventures no one ever named. Julian was on his feet. The money didn't vanish in the collapse. The collapse was the laundry *. They pulled it out before the crash and buried the theft under the wreckage, his investors' money and my family's name both, which means the men Cornelius ruined included a small country gentleman named Thomas Fairchild. Rosalind heard her own voice go thin. "That's where Papa's debts began. That crash. He spent everything after it year after year. I thought it was bad luck. Everyone thought it was bad luck. But there was one person in the house who had never thought it was bad luck. One person who had spent 15 years, quietly, stubbornly, in the corner of every ledger and letter, doing something no one had asked about. And so it was that at 2 o'clock in the morning, the Duke of Ravenscroft and the widow Grantham stood on either side of a wheeled chair in a lamplit room, and Thomas Fairchild, slow, laboring, ferocious, gave them the missing piece. Not luck. Each word cost him, he paid gladly. Proof. I found proof. Cornelius took the money out before someone highly placed helped, a lady. I had letters, bank drafts, 15 years collecting." His good hand closed hard on Rosalind's. 3 years ago finally enough, found a lawyer willing, told him everything. 2 weeks later, his ruined mouth twisted, every debt called in, all at once. Then the ball. Then he touched his own frozen cheek, and the gesture said the rest. "They knew," Julian said softly. "God in heaven, the debts, the ball, all of it. It was never about a patched gown. Your father was 2 weeks from a courtroom and they buried him before he could speak. And when his daughter walked into my ballroom straight toward me, he closed his eyes. My mother didn't humiliate you out of pride, Rosalind. She was terrified. She had one moment to make sure the name Fairchild became a joke instead of a witness, and she used my mouth to do it. The proof." Rosalind knelt by the chair. "Papa, the letters, the bank drafts. The creditors took the house, the furniture, everything. Where?" And her father smiled. It was lopsided and slow, and it was the smile of a chess player 15 years into a game everyone else had forgotten was being played. "Who robs a poor man's memories," he said. "Your mother's trunk, child, her wedding dress. I sewed them into the lining the night before the ball." His eyes glittered, wet and bright and utterly alive. "You've been carrying the proof through every house in England." Rosalind ran. The trunk was in her dressing room. It had been in every dressing room of every house. The one thing the patchwork beggar had never sold, never left behind. She tore up the folded remnants of rose silk and ivory, and there, Beneath a false canvas bottom stitched by a father's trembling hands on the worst night of his life, lay a flat oilskin packet, and inside it, dry and patient and lethal, letters in Cornelius Grantham's hand, bank drafts, and one single page, of instructions regarding the removal of funds, in a script whose every capital R kicked to the right. She came back down the stairs holding 15 years of truth against her chest, and found Julian waiting at the bottom, and for a moment neither of them could speak. "The hearing is Thursday," he said finally. "They expect me to lie for my estate. My mother has already told Cedric's counsel I'm bought." Something moved behind his eyes, grief, and beneath the grief, iron. "Let them believe it. Call me as their witness, Rosalind. Put me in that chair in front of all of London." Julian. His name came out of her for the first time just like that, without title or armor, and they both heard it. "If you do this, the forgeries, the borrowing, all of it becomes public. It won't only ruin her. It's your name too, your father's name, 300 years of it, the estate. You'll lose everything either way." "Yes," he said it almost peacefully. And then the Duke of Ravenscroft did the last thing she ever expected. He smiled, tired and real and free. "You once told me apologies are banknotes and their value depends on the bank. You were right. I've had 3 years to think about what was in my bank, madam, and it comes to exactly one thing worth anything at all." He looked at her father's proof, held against her heart. "Let me finally pay." The Court of Chancery had never been so full. They came for a hanging. Society always knows the smell, and Cedric Grantham, in a splendid new coat, wore the ease of a man whose noose was bought and knotted. The nurse had performed. The footman had performed. And now his counsel, called the witness London, had truly come for His Grace, the Duke of Ravenscroft, and the room leaned forward as one body. And in the gallery the Dowager Duchess allowed herself, behind her fan, the small private smile of a woman whose son had always, in the end, obeyed. Julian took the oath. He looked once at Rosalind, seated straight back beside her lawyers in grey. "Your Grace," Cedric's counsel began, silky, "you spent this past season in close company with the respondent. Will you tell the court what you learned of her character, and of her designs?" "Gladly," said the Duke of Ravenscroft. And he turned to face the room that had laughed with him once, and this time he did not obey. "I learned that 3 years ago my family destroyed hers to keep an honest man out of a courtroom. I learned that the instructions were signed in my name, in my hand, a hand forged by the person who taught me to write. I learned that this week I was offered my entire estate back. Here is the letter, my lord. The court will find the handwriting instructive, to sit in this chair and lie about her." And I learned. His voice did not rise. The room had gone so silent it didn't need to, that everything this petition says of Mrs. Grantham is the confession of the people who wrote it, wearing her name. They are practiced at that. 16 years ago they buried a stolen fortune under a shipwreck, my lord, and the proof has spent 3 years sewn into the lining of a poor woman's wedding dress, which the court will now hear from Mr. Thomas Fairchild, who has waited 15 years, one word at a time, to be believed. Uproar, the gavel, uproar again. In the gallery, very slowly, the Dowager Duchess of Ravenscroft lowered her fan, and for the first time in 40 years, London saw her face without one. And through the roar, Cedric's counsel, drowning, played the last card in the brief. "My lord, this is theatre. The witness is plainly the respondent's creature, bought or besotted or both. Why on earth should this court believe a ruined man burning his own house?" The room subsided, hungry for the answer. Julian looked one more time at Rosalind. "Because I have been paying a debt in secret for 3 years, he said quietly. "To a man I broke with a laugh, and I find I am no longer willing to pay it in secret. Ask Dr. Everett of Kent, who has settled his account since that October. Then ask yourselves, my lord, What kind of schemer ruins himself for the one woman in England holding all his debts? He rose from the witness chair and bowed not to the court. To her. The great case of Grantham v. Grantham did not take a year. It did not even take a month. It took 9 days of a London that talked of nothing else, and it ended the way a storm ends, all at once, with the world rinsed strange and clean. The petition was dismissed with words from the bench that the newspapers printed in full, and Charlotte read aloud at breakfast 3 times, doing the judge's voice. A proceeding conceived in malice, built upon perjury, and pursued in the hope that this court could be made an instrument of the very fraud it exists to punish. The nurse recanted on the 4th day. The footman fled on the 5th. And on the last morning, as Cedric Grantham attempted to board a packet boat at Dover under a name that fooled no one, he was arrested on the dock for conspiracy, for suborning perjury, and once Sparrow's file and the oilskin packet had been read into evidence, for his continuing role in the oldest charge of all, the fraud of 20 years ago, inherited from his father along with the debts of it. Blood, it turned out, was blood. The courts of England respected it. The Dowager Duchess of Ravenscroft was never tried. Rosalind understood the arithmetic of it, the age, the rank, the horror of peers at seeing one of their own in a dock, and found, to her own surprise, that she did not need the trial. What happened instead was, in the currency of the Dowager's world, a colder sentence. The world simply closed. Every door that had ever flown open at her name shut without a sound, all at once, forever. She retired, the word the papers used, to a small, damp house on the northern edge of the Ravenscroft lands, with 2 servants and no visitors, to live a long time on the one income her son's lawyers allowed her. She wrote Julian 1 letter from exile. He read it standing once and burned it, and never told anyone what it said. But Rosalind, who had grown very good at watching faces, noticed that he stood at the window a long while afterward, and that what was in his face was not grief in the end, but the particular stillness of a man who has stopped listening for a voice. The Grantham fortune came out of the courthouse basement larger than it went in, the way fortunes do when the whole country has spent a month learning to respect them. And Thomas Fairchild, vindicated, printed, believed at last, became, for one improbable season, the most celebrated man in England, the broken gentleman who had beaten them all with a needle and thread in 15 years of patience. Strangers wrote to him. A judge sent his compliments. He bore it, his daughter observed, with enormous, shameless enjoyment, and had Charlotte read him his own newspaper mentions in the garden twice, doing all the voices. Only one piece of business remained. And for 11 days after the verdict, the one man it concerned did not come. He came on the 12th evening at the hour between lamps and dark, on foot, in a plain coat, and when the butler announced him, Rosalind was in Edward's study with the black lacquered box open on the desk, because she had known, somehow, that it would be tonight, the way one knows weather. He stopped just inside the door. He looked tired and thinner and younger all at once. "Mrs. Grantham." "Your Grace." "Not for much longer, I imagine." He said it without self-pity, almost with relief. "That's rather why I've come. The lawyers have finished their sums. What the scandal didn't take, the restitution will. Every family Cornelius and my mother ruined is to be repaid from Ravenscroft to the last shilling. I signed it yesterday. It was the finest morning of my life." He drew a breath. "The estate will survive it, barely, a smaller thing, an honest thing. But the debts you hold, madam, it cannot pay. Not now, likely not ever, so I've come to say what a gentleman says when he cannot pay." He straightened, and she saw what the 12 days had been for. He had been readying himself to lose everything with his back straight. "I have no offer to make you, no terms, no cleverness. You hold Ravenscroft, and you are owed it more than the law knows. I came only to tell you that whatever you decide to do with my house, my name, and my ruin, I will call it justice, and I will call it nothing else, and I wanted you to hear that from me standing up." The fire ticked. Outside, a carriage passed and faded. "You came here," Rosalind said slowly, "with nothing." "Yes." "No plea, no bargain, not even the roses." "You burned my letters," he said. "A man learns." "Empty hands, then?" "Not quite." And here, for the first time, the composure flickered. His hand went to his breast pocket, hesitated, and came out holding something so small she had to come around the desk to see it. It lay on his open palm, a scrap of ivory silk, no bigger than a playing card, worn soft as breath at the edges, the way a thing wears when it has been touched every day for 3 years. Rosalind stood very still. "You dropped it on my steps," Julian said quietly. The night. I picked it up before I understood why, and then I couldn't put it down, and then it was 3 years later, and it had been to Scotland and back, and to every ball in London in this pocket over." He stopped and finished simply, "Where it is now." I told myself it was a reminder, penance. It wasn't. Rosalind, the truth is smaller and worse. It was the only piece of you I thought I'd ever be allowed to keep. He held it out to her. "It's yours. It was always yours. It's the last thing I have, that is, and I'm told a gentleman settles his debts before he goes." She took it. The silk weighed nothing, a cutting from a wedding dress, a patch from a laughed-at gown, and it was the heaviest thing anyone had ever put in her hand. And Rosalind Grantham, who had planned everything for 3 years, did the one thing she had never planned. She turned to the desk, lifted from the black lacquered box the bundle of papers tied in faded red ribbon, 4 mortgages, 11 promissory notes, 300 years of Ravenscroft, the whole architecture of her revenge, crossed to the fireplace and laid it on the flames. "Rosalind," he started forward. "What are you? That's the estate, that's everything. You can't." "I can, I've checked, it's mine." The ribbon caught first, then the old paper, gloriously all at once, and the room went gold. She watched it burn with her back to him, and her voice, when it came, was steady. "Edward told me something at the end. He said the only debt that ever ruined anyone was the one they wouldn't forgive. I thought I understood it. I didn't, not until I watched you sit in that chair and set fire to your own name for mine." She turned around. The last of Ravenscroft's chains curled into ash behind her. "Besides, Your Grace, you've mistaken your creditor. The debt was never owed to me. It was owed to a girl in a patched gown who needed one kind word and got a laugh, and I am no longer authorized to collect on her behalf." She looked down at the scrap of ivory silk in her hand and up at him and smiled, and it was not Edward's smile, not the sword smile, but the other one, the one from before all of it. "That girl is free, Julian. As of tonight, so are you. So am I. The account is closed." For a moment he could not speak at all. When he could, his voice had gone rough. "Then I find I must open a new one." He crossed the room and took both her hands, the silk pressed between them, and went, before she could stop him, down on one knee on Edward Grantham's hearthrug, firelight and ash and all. "I have no fortune. As of this evening I understand I no longer even have debts, which for an Ashworth is an entirely new sensation. I have a half-drowned estate, a name I intend to spend my life washing, a standing chest to feed every Thursday from your father, and one question I have wanted to ask since a woman in midnight silk crossed my ballroom and made 300 people bow to what they'd laughed at." His hands were shaking. Hers, she noticed with distant wonder, were not. "Marry me, Rosalind. Not the widow, not the fortune, God knows, not the fortune. My solicitor may actually weep, you asterisk. Marry me, and I will spend every day I'm given being the man who deserved that first dance and missed it." And Rosalind, who had entered his house twice, once in patches and once in diamonds, laughed. It was the first time he had ever heard it. It was worth, he would tell her later, every acre he had lost. "Ask me properly," she said. "Ask the girl." He understood. He kissed the scrap of ivory silk in her hand, 3 years of it, and asked again. And this time he asked Miss Fairchild asterisk, and Miss Fairchild, after 3 years, 2 fortunes and 1 October, finally said yes. They were married in June from Grantham House, and all of London came, the same London, wearing its best clothes and its shortest memory, and privately agreed, fan to fan, pew to pew, that they had known all along it would end this way, and had said so from the very first. The bride wore no diamonds. She came down the aisle on her father's arm. He had sworn to walk it, and he did, every slow, thunderous, triumphant step of it, while the Duke at the altar wept with no dignity whatsoever. And her gown was cream silk, the finest that money could buy, cut in the latest fashion by the best house in Paris. And at the hem, worked into the bodice, set at the heart of all that perfection where no one could possibly miss it, patches. Ivory patches, worn soft at the edges, an old wedding dress carried on into a new one, a mother's silk, a father's hiding place, a scrap that had lived 3 years in a duke's breast pocket, laughed at once by 300 people. The richest wedding gown in England, patched, and every woman in that church, whether she understood the story or not, found her eyes stinging at it, because some things the heart reads without being told. At the altar, Julian bent close as he took her hand. "They're all staring at the patches," he murmured. "Good," said Rosalind. "Let them look properly this time." Years later, Ravenscroft woke early these days. It had not always been so. There had been years, the servants still spoke of them in the comfortable way people speak of storms long past, when the great house had slept until noon behind drawn curtains, hoarding its candles, hushing its footsteps, hiding its emptiness from the road. A house pretending, a house holding its breath. Now it woke at 6, when the farm carts came up the north lane, and by 7 the kitchens were roaring, and by 8 the whole vast building hummed like a hive in clover. Because Ravenscroft, for the first time in living memory, was not pretending anything at all. The estate had been rebuilt the way its mistress did everything, quietly, precisely, and from the ground up. The Duchess of Ravenscroft, London, had needed almost a year to learn to say the words without a delicious little pause in the middle, had arrived with her merchant fortune and done the unthinkable. She had treated 700 noble acres like a business. She drained fields that had flooded for a century because no one had asked the tenant farmers why. She replaced the steward who padded the books with the tenant farmer's son who had caught him doing it. She put Grantham ships behind Ravenscroft wool, and Ravenscroft grain behind Grantham contracts, and within 3 years, the estate that had once been mortgaged to its last chandelier was lending money to its neighbors, at fair terms, and with a discretion that would have made Edward Grantham nod slowly over his spectacles. The chandeliers, it should be said, were now entirely paid for. The Duke had insisted on settling that particular account first, over his wife's laughing objection that she was hardly likely to repossess them. "You did threaten to, once," he'd reminded her. "At a ball, you told me to take good care of them." "I was being sinister." "You were magnificent. I didn't sleep for a week. The chandeliers get paid for first." And along the east wall of the gardens, where the new head gardener had twice proposed clearing the untidy tangle of briar roses, and twice been refused in writing, the small, half-wild blooms still grew exactly where no one had planned them. Every June, on a certain morning, a jar of them appeared on the Duchess's desk with no card at all. After 5 years, no card was necessary. The nursery wing had been reopened in the second spring, and it was, by the third, the loudest and least dignified corner of the house. Edward Thomas Ashworth, Marquis of something his father could never remember because the boy refused to answer to it, was 4 years old, dark-haired and possessed of his grandfather Fairchild's chess-playing stare and his namesake's alarming gift for negotiation. At 3, he had traded his sister's coral rattle to a footman for a frog. When the fraud was discovered, he had listened to his mother's careful explanation of honest dealing, considered it, and offered to return the frog for 2 rattles, because now it is a better frog. Rosalind had been obliged to leave the room. Through the door, Julian heard her laughing until she wept, and the words, "Edward, oh, Edward, do you see him? Do you see what you've done?" The frog stayed. It was named Cedric. Nobody had taught the boy this. Certain things, the Duke maintained, simply traveled in the blood. His sister, Lady Rose Ashworth, was too golden and utterly without fear, of horses, of thunder, of the vast portraits of dead Ashworths in the long gallery, whom she saluted each morning like a small general reviewing dubious troops. She had her father's eyes, her mother's chin, and the household's total surrender. Her first word had not been "Mama" or "Papa." It had been, to the eternal, tearful triumph of the old man in the wheeled chair who had spent months coaching her in secret, one slow syllable at a time, "Grandpapa." Thomas Fairchild had come to Ravenscroft with the wedding party 5 years ago, for a fortnight only until you're settled, and had never left. He had a sunlit room in the south wing overlooking the Rose Wall, a standing Thursday appointment across the chessboard from his son-in-law. The score after 5 years stood at 181 games to 12, and the 12 were charity, and both men knew it, and neither ever said so, and a granddaughter who ruled him absolutely. His speech had never fully returned. It no longer needed to. The house had learned his rhythms as one learns a beloved piece of music, and besides, as he told his daughter one evening, working through the sentence with his old, unhurried stubbornness. Spent 15 years saying nothing to anyone. Now everyone waits to hear me. The crooked smile. Should have gone slower years ago. He was wheeled out to the Rose Wall most mornings. Some days Julian walked beside the chair, and the 2 men would stop at the east corner, where the briars grew thickest, and say nothing at all together for a quarter of an hour, in the manner of men who had settled everything that could be settled and found the silence on the far side of it very good country. Of the others, the years had disposed as years do. Cedric Grantham had been convicted on all counts in the spring following the great case, and sentenced to 14 years transportation. He wrote letters from New South Wales, first threatening, then legal, then pleading, and finally, in the 4th year, one that was merely human, a gray, tired page asking whether his uncle had ever, even once, spoken of him with anything but contempt. Rosalind had answered that one. He said you checked the newspapers every morning hoping to find his name among the deaths, asterisk she wrote, and he laughed when he said it, because he had decided long before to leave you nothing, and a man who has decided can afford to laugh. I am sorry for you. He would not have been, and I find I trust his judgment in most things. RG, there were no more letters. Mr. Sparrow, trembling, gin-soaked, conscience-ridden Mr. Sparrow, whose kept file had broken the whole conspiracy open, had appeared at Grantham House a month after the verdict, had in his hands, to ask whether Madam knew of any honest employment for a dishonest lawyer. Madam had known of some. 5 years on, Mr. Sparrow ran the charitable accounts of the Grantham interests from a neat office above the Kent warehouses, dry as a Methodist, ferocious as a terrier, and devoted to his employer with the whole undivided force of a man who has been forgiven exactly once and knows precisely what it is worth. It was Sparrow who managed the quiet fund that had, over 5 years, without a single public word, repaid every family ruined in Cornelius Grantham's crash of 20 years before, hunting the scattered heirs through parish registers and shipping lists, presenting each astonished household with a lawyer's letter, a banker's draft, and no explanation whatsoever. They keep writing to ask who their benefactor is, he reported each quarter. And you keep telling them that the debt is old, madam, and the account is closed. He permitted himself each quarter the same small, dry smile. It does not satisfy them in the least. It appears to satisfy you. It does, Mr. Sparrow. It appears to be a family weakness. Charlotte, dear Charlotte, who had sailed up an empty street with her chin out when all London pointed the other way, was godmother to both children, a fixture at Ravenscroft every autumn, and the only human being alive permitted to tell the story of the opera house summons at dinner parties, which she did with a full cast of voices and a dropped glass at the climax. Her unimportant, kind husband had been offered, in the quiet way such things moved, a position of importance. He had grown into it exactly as kind men do. Neither of them ever knew for certain whose word had done it. Both of them suspected. Charlotte, catching her friend's eye across a table once, had raised her glass one small, private inch, and Rosalind, remembering another raised glass on another staircase, had laughed out loud at the difference 5 years could make in the same gesture. And in a small, damp house on the northern edge of the estate, the Dowager Duchess of Ravenscroft grew old alone, at long tables set for one. She had never asked to see her grandchildren. That, Rosalind thought, was the measure of her, truer than the forgeries. Even ruined, she would not stoop to want what she wanted. Julian went to her once each year on her birthday, out of a duty he did not pretend was affection. He sat 1 hour, spoke of the weather and the tenants, and left. He never took the children. He never brought a message back. But in the third winter, word had come up to the great house that the Dowager was ill, and it was not the Duke who ordered the carriage. Rosalind had sat in the cold, formal little parlor, the best chair, unasked, uninvited, an old debt of manners repaid to the penny, across from the woman who had orchestrated her family's destruction, and the two of them had regarded each other for a long moment over the tea neither touched. "You've come to gloat," the old woman said at last. "You people always do in the end." "No, your grace, I've come to send Dr. Everett. He attends my father. He is the best in the county. He'll call Thursdays." Rosalind rose and drew on her gloves. "You'll want to know why, and you'll suspect everything but the truth, so I'll leave it with you to save you the years. A very good man once taught me that the only debt that ever ruined anyone was the one they wouldn't forgive." She paused at the door. "You are not forgiven, madam." "I'm not capable of it, and I've stopped pretending that's a virtue I'm obliged to grow. But my hatred was ruining me, and I've had it out of the house like a bad drain. The doctor comes Thursdays. Good afternoon." The Dowager lived 4 more years, tended by the best physician in the county, and never once said thank you. But she took the Thursdays. And then there was the ball. It had begun as a private joke between husband and wife, in the first autumn of their marriage, when the invitations to the traditional Ravenscroft ball were being drawn up, and Julian had gone very quiet over the guest list. "Say it," Rosalind had said, not looking up from her ledger. "I was thinking of the last list this house sent out that mattered, 300 names, and the one name that wasn't on it, the only person in that ballroom worth knowing, had to beg her way in through a friend in her mother's made-over gown to ask me for 6 months I could have granted between dances." He had set the list down. "I find I don't want this ball, Rosalind. Not this one. Not ever again, not the way it was. I want—" He'd stopped, searching, and then his face had changed the way it did when the right thing arrived whole. "I want the *other guest list, the one nobody in England has ever written." The first patched gown ball was held that October, on the anniversary nobody named aloud, and London did not know what to make of it at all. The invitation itself was the scandal of the season. Heavy cream card, ducal crest, everything correct, and then, where the ordinary flourishes should be, 2 lines that were repeated, disbelieved, and reread in every drawing room in the county. Every guest is required to wear, in plain sight, 1 patch, honestly come by or honestly made. Guests arriving flawless will be turned away with the greatest possible courtesy. And below that, smaller: "The evening is given in honor of the young ladies of this county whose gowns have been mended oftener than admired. They will be presented at 10 o'clock. They are the guests of honor. Everyone else is merely invited." Society came, of course. Society always comes. That is its tragedy and its usefulness. It came the first year smirking, wearing dainty ornamental patches of silk and sapphire, ready to be amused, and found the Duke of Ravenscroft in his father's magnificent formal coat with a square of plain, worn ivory linen stitched over the breast, exactly where a medal would sit, and the Duchess in Paris satin with her famous patches at the heart of the bodice, receiving 300 guests beneath chandeliers that had once laughed. At 10 o'clock the music stopped, and the doors at the head of the great staircase opened, and 11 girls came down into the silence, daughters of curates and half-pay officers and gentlemen gone under, girls of the precise kind that ballrooms like this one had been eating alive for 100 years, each in her honest, mended best, each with her chin up because a formidable woman in Paris satin had spent the preceding hour in the cloakroom telling them a story about a girl, a duke, and a gown, and had finished it by saying, "They can smell fear in there, so we will give them nothing to smell. Chins up. You are the guests of honor. I have the invitations to prove it, and I am very rich and very fond of proving things." And the Duke of Ravenscroft crossed his own ballroom floor, the whole length of it, alone, 300 of the finest heads in the county turning to follow him, and bowed to the most terrified girl in the line, a rector's daughter of 17 in twice-turned blue muslin, as deeply as he had ever bowed to a princess. "Miss," he said, in a voice pitched to carry to the last mirror, "may I have the honor of the first dance?" That was the moment, the servant still told it, when old Mr. Fairchild, stationed in his wheeled chair at the edge of the floor, had begun to applaud. Alone at first, one good hand against the arm of the chair, slow and loud and daring the room, and the room, which 5 years earlier had needed only one man's laugh for permission, discovered that it needed only one man's applause, and 300 people who had come to smirk stood up and thundered. Every girl presented at that first ball had received, quietly in the following month, by way of a dry little lawyer in Kent, a settled dowry fund and a letter stating only that the debt was old and the account was closed. 4 of the 11 were now married. One, to the astonishment of everyone but the Duchess, was managing the Grantham shipping office in Portsmouth better than the 3 men who had held the post before her combined. By the 3rd year, the patched gown ball was the most sought invitation in 6 counties, and the patches themselves had become, London being incorrigibly London, high fashion. Great ladies competed. Patches were embroidered in Venice, sewn with seed pearls, cut from grandmothers' christening gowns and dead soldiers' letters and wedding dresses of every vintage. And if most of it was vanity, well, the Duchess observed, watching a countess proudly display a patch cut from her late husband's regimental colors, vanity harnessed to kindness pulls the same weight as virtue and eats less. "You've made mending fashionable," Charlotte marveled. "You've made poverty fashionable. Do you know what you've actually done, Rosalind? You've made it impossible to laugh at a patched gown anywhere in England. There's probably a girl in Yorkshire tonight wearing her mother's made-over silk to an assembly, and if anyone dares titter, 40 people will assume the gown is a Ravenscroft original and ask where she had it done." That, said the Duchess of Ravenscroft, was the entire idea. Which brings us at last to tonight. The 5th patched gown ball, October again, and Ravenscroft ablaze, every window gold, every chandelier lit and honestly owned, carriages up the drive in a river of lamps. In the hall below, 300 guests in their patches, pearl-sewn and paper-plain, glorious and threadbare, and this year by the door a discreet basket of plain linen squares and pinned needles for any guest who had forgotten, because the Duchess left no loophole unsewn. On the upstairs landing, in the shadow of the banisters, 2 small figures in nightclothes were flagrantly not in bed. "That one has a patch made of asterisk diamonds," reported Lord Edward, nose between the rails. "Papa says diamond patches are missing the point," said Rose, with the serene authority of her 2 years and her father's exact intonation. But Mama says let them, because their money reaches the point even when they don't. Below, at the foot of the great staircase, the Duke of Ravenscroft stood where he stood every year at 10 o'clock, and the Duchess watched him from the first landing, as she did every year, her hand resting on the marble where, once, in another life, a torn hem had caught on the steps outside these very doors. She wore the patches tonight, as always the wedding bodice itself, remade around them for the 5th time by a Paris house that had standing orders never to touch the ivory squares. In her private sitting room, in a black lacquered box that had once held the fate of this estate, there now lay only 3 things: a scrap of silk worn soft as breath, a card about briar roses, and a bundle of cold ashes in a twist of paper, which her husband did not know she had raked from the study fire 5 years ago and kept, because Edward Grantham's student never destroyed the records of a closed account, and because some victories deserve a file. The music stopped. The doors at the head of the stairs opened. This year there were 14 girls, and they came down into the great warm silence with their chins up, all but the last. The last was small, and perhaps 16, in gray wool with a linen patch at the shoulder that had been mended in haste, by candlelight. By hands that shook, Rosalind knew that stitching the way soldiers know each other's wounds. The girl stopped dead 2 steps down. In the full blaze of the chandeliers, 300 faces turned up at her, and Rosalind saw her eyes go wide and glassy, saw her breath fail, saw 16 years of shabby doorways and other girls' laughter rise up in her all at once. The precise look of a sparrow that has flown into a palace of peacocks and only just understood it. Rosalind took 1 step toward the stairs. She never needed the second, because the Duke of Ravenscroft was already moving across the whole shining length of his ballroom, alone, unhurried, 300 of the finest heads in England turning to follow him as they had turned once before, long ago, for a very different reason. He reached the foot of the great staircase and looked up at the frozen girl in gray wool. And then, before all of them, the first gentleman of the county did what he did every year, and what he would do, God willing, every October of his life. He bowed low to the patch. "Miss," he said, and his voice carried to the last mirror in the room, "you are standing exactly where the finest person I ever met once stood." She was frightened too, though you'd never have known it. She had a way of putting her chin up that I have spent years trying to describe. You are among friends in this house. You are, in fact, the reason it exists. He straightened and offered his hand and smiled, and it was not the smile of a duke, but of a man permanently, gratefully astonished by his own life. "May I have the honor of the first dance?" The girl in gray looked down at the offered hand, then up past the Duke to the landing, where a woman in patched Paris satin stood watching and pressed her hand once to her own bodice, chin up. The girl put her chin up and came down the last 2 steps and danced. The orchestra swept in around them, and then the floor filled, 14 girls in mended gowns partnered by half the peerage of 6 counties, an old man in a wheeled chair keeping time with his good hand, a Kentish lawyer standing at attention by the door as if guarding the whole occasion personally, 2 children hanging through the banisters until their nurse hauled them off to bed in fits of giggles. And the Duchess of Ravenscroft stood on the landing above it all, her hand on the cool marble, and let herself do the arithmetic one last time. 3 years of ruin, 3 years of gold, 5 years of this. 1 laugh, 1 gown, 1 old man's offer over a cold cup of tea, 1 scrap of silk carried in a breast pocket through every ballroom in London. She thought of Edward as she did every October. You wish to see what happens when they must bow to you instead. Look down there, my dear, they've made it an annual fixture, and she thought of a girl on the 6th of October, walking a torn hem out into the dark, certain her life had just ended. It had, Rosalind thought. That was the mercy of it. Something better needed the room. Below her, her husband was laughing at something the rector's daughter had dared to say. His real laugh, the one his mother had never met. And the sound of it rose and mixed with the music, and the 14 girls and the whole bright, mended, impossible evening. Up past the chandeliers that had once been debts, out through the tall windows where a duke had stood alone at midnight with a scrap of ivory silk, and away over the east wall, where the briar roses grew exactly where no one had planned them, and outlived everything. They say the tradition continues at Ravenscroft to this day. They say the invitation still carries the 2 famous lines, and the basket of linen squares still waits by the door, and the first dance still belongs, every October, to the most frightened girl on the staircase. And they say the servants, the tenants, the 14 times mended county itself, that in all the years since, whatever else has echoed under those chandeliers, no one ever laughed in that ballroom again, except with joy. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. If you enjoyed one of our stories, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can join as a member or send a super thanks or super chat. Your support helps us continue creating more stories like this. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories.